Recruits don't speak in my war room. You want to watch grown-ups work, you do it from the hallway." The voice carried across the floor the way a young man's voice always does when he has an audience, and no idea how small his stage really is. It bounced off the bank of monitors along the far wall, off the long map board with its checkpoints and grid lines glowing in amber, off the low ceiling that a joint special operations task force had inherited 3 weeks earlier and had not yet learned to love. It was 2100 hours. The Combat Operations Center was standing itself up out of boxes and cable runs and half-labeled panels, and everyone in it was tired in the particular way of people building something in the dark. First Lieutenant Grady Nolan stood in the middle of that room with his sleeves pressed to a crease and his chin lifted, and he was looking at a woman in a plain blue jacket who had not moved. The room around him was the strange, unfinished thing that a new headquarters always is in its first weeks. Half the workstations still wore their protective film. A run of cable lay taped along the floor under a rubber ramp, and someone had labeled the network "Panels" in marker because the printed placards had not come. 2 large screens on the front wall showed the common operating picture. A third showed only a slow spinning icon where a feed had not yet been brought up. It smelled of new carpet and old coffee, and the ozone of too many machines in too small a space. It was the kind of room where a man could believe, if he were young enough and had held the watch just long enough, that he was the center of something. She stood at the back, near the wall where the map light did not quite reach, and she was reading the board. That was all she was doing. An escort-required visitor badge hung at her chest on a lanyard, the kind they hand out at the front desk to contractors and family members and civilians who have business on a post and no reason to be trusted with it. Her jacket was blue and unremarkable. Her hair was regular and gray-streaked and pulled back plainly. She looked like someone's aunt who had taken a wrong turn on Family Day and ended up somewhere with too many screens. She did not startle, and she did not step back. She read the wall the way a mason reads a wall he has built, her eyes moving across it in a slow, trained sweep. Checkpoint, phase line, grid, the little clustered icons that meant units, the timestamps ticking in the corner. She read it the way a person reads a language they dreamed in. Command Sergeant Major Elias Thorne saw her before he heard Nolan. He was 53 years old, and he had spent 31 of those years learning to read people the way she was reading that board, and what he read on her was not confusion. It was not the shrinking posture of a civilian who has wandered somewhere frightening. It was stillness. It was the stillness of someone standing exactly where she intended to stand, waiting for something she already knew was coming. He had seen that stillness before, in men and in women who had done things the rest of the army only read about, and it had never once, in 31 years, belonged to a tourist. Thorne said nothing. He had learned, across 3 decades, that the most important thing a senior man can do in a loud room is get quiet and watch. So he leaned a shoulder against the cool edge of a server rack, and he crossed his arms, and he watched. Nolan crossed to her. He was 26, and he had been the battle captain on the night watch for exactly 11 days. And 11 days is just long enough for a certain kind of young officer to mistake a chair for a throne. He raised his voice a notch more than the distance required, because 2 junior officers were standing by the coffee urn, and a battle captain performs. "Ma'am, this is a classified floor. I don't know how you got a badge, but you can't stand there staring at my board. Personnel is 2 buildings down. If you're lost, someone will walk you." The woman turned her head, unhurried, and looked at him. She did not look afraid, and she did not look impressed. "I'm not lost," she said. 4 words. Quiet, even. Somebody by the urn laughed, a short bark of a laugh that a man lets out when he's decided in advance which way a scene is going to go. The woman did not react to the laugh at all. She turned back to the board, and then, so low that it was nearly to herself. She said, "Your checkpoint on the northern phase line is transposed. It should read 4-6, not 6-4. Command Sergeant Major Thorne went very still. Because a lost aunt does not say that. A contractor does not say that. A civilian who took a wrong turn on Family Day does not glance at a battle tracking board she has never seen before and pick, out of 200 glowing symbols, the one digit that is wrong. Only someone who has stood in a place where a transposed grid gets a man killed says that, and says it the way she said it, not to win anything, not to be caught saying it, but because to her a wrong number on a wall was simply a thing that ought to be right, the way a crooked picture in a hallway is a thing that ought to be straight. Nolan did not hear it that way. Nolan heard a stranger touch his board. "That board," he said, "is battle-tracked by soldiers with clearances you don't have. I'd worry less about my grids, and more about how you're going to explain a visitor badge on a floor like this." But the room had shifted a half-degree, the way a room does before anyone can name why, and at the signals bench a young specialist named Wyatt Boone, 21, looked up from his screen and did not laugh at all. Boone had been on the floor for 6 months. He had learned the difference between the officers who knew things and the officers who performed them, and something about the flat calm of the woman by the wall had made the hair on his arms stand up. Thorne walked to the map board. He walked without hurry, the way he did everything, and he found the northern phase line, and he found the checkpoint she had flagged, and he stood in front of it for a long moment, with his reading glasses pushed up into his gray hair. The reference read 6-4. He pulled the source overlay, the one the day shift had built, and no one on nights had double-checked, because no one on nights had reason to, and he traced it back to the operations order, line by line, and the operations order read 4-6. A day shift analyst had fat-fingered a checkpoint, and the error had lived on the board for 11 hours, and not one credentialed soul on 2 shifts had caught it, until a woman in a blue jacket had glanced at the wall on her way to being called a tourist. She was right. A transposed digit, buried in a board full of them, on a phase line that mattered. Thorne turned and looked at the woman in the blue jacket with new eyes, and this time he was not reading her bearing. He was reading the specific, unmistakable fact that she had done something no one in this room could have done, and had done it without appearing to try, and had then gone quiet again, as if it cost her nothing. He crossed back to her, and he lowered his voice so that it was between the two of them. "Where'd you serve, ma'am?" She met his eyes. Something passed behind hers, something old and level, and for a moment Thorne had the distinct sensation of a very senior person deciding how much to give a stranger. Then she gave him almost nothing, a small, precise look, the look of a person who has spent a career keeping her name off of things. "A while ago," she said. "Different wall." "That's not an answer, Sergeant Major," she added, almost kindly. "And I think you already know it isn't. Give it 5 minutes. Nolan had followed Thorne back, unwilling to let the sergeant major carry the moment. He did not like that the CSM was talking to his uninvited visitor like she was a person. He did not like the way the room had gone quiet around her, or the way Boone kept glancing over, or the fact that the board, his board, had apparently been wrong, and a stranger had been the one to say so. He turned to Boone at the signals bench. "Specialist, log a security note. Unescorted visitor on the floor, refused to relocate. Time now." Boone's hands hovered over the keys. He looked at the woman, and he looked at Nolan, and he did the thing that a decent young soldier does when two authorities point in opposite directions. He hesitated. The woman spoke, and she spoke to Boone, gently, the way you'd speak to steady someone else's animal. "Don't," she said. Your badge desk will already have my name. You don't want your note to contradict their log. When two records disagree, specialist, the young one always loses the argument. Save yourself the paperwork." It was such a strange, specific thing to say. It was the sentence of a person who knew exactly how a badge desk worked, exactly how a security log worked, exactly how a young soldier could get himself crosswise with a record that would outlive the moment. It landed on Boone, and Boone took his hands off the keys and set them flat on the desk. And he looked at her, the way you look at a person who has just, quietly, done you a kindness you don't fully understand yet. On the radio, the current watch fumbled a call. A relay came through garbled, and a young officer keyed back the wrong brevity word, the kind of small sloppiness that creeps in at the tired end of a shift. And under her breath, not for anyone, the woman in the blue jacket supplied the correct one, the right word, in the right cadence, with the clipped economy of someone who had said it 1,000 times on nights that were not this quiet. Thorne heard it. He had not moved. That was the thing he would remember later, that she never once moved toward anything. She did not step to the board. She did not reach for a handset. Her whole body stayed still with an economy that was almost eerie, and yet her attention filled the room, went everywhere, touched the exits, and the clock, and the board, and the door, and missed nothing. It was the way a person stands who has learned, somewhere expensive, that motion draws fire and stillness keeps you alive. Thorne stepped off the floor and went down the short corridor to the badge desk, and he asked the specialist there to pull the escort log for 2,100 hours, and when the specialist turned the monitor toward him, Command Sergeant Major Elias Thorne read the name printed there and felt the floor tilt very slightly under 31 years of certainty. He read it twice. He read the rank and the name and the 2 words beside it in the purpose field, and he took his reading glasses off and pressed the bridge of his nose, and then he put them back on and read it a 3rd time to be absolutely sure the world was what it had just become. Back on the floor, the audience had grown. The 2 junior officers from the coffee urn had drifted over, drawn by the smell of a story they could tell later, and Nolan, who had an audience again, was playing to it. He had decided the woman was a bit, a small comedy he was performing, and he had given her a name. "The tourist," he said, tipping his head toward her for the officers. "We've got a tourist. She likes the board. Real fan of the board. Corrected my grids and everything. Maybe we should put her on days." The officers laughed. The woman stood in the not quite reach of the map light, and against their loud, easy motion her stillness was its own kind of statement, though none of them could read it. She had folded her hands loosely in front of her. She was watching the front wall now, the 2 large screens, the slow-spinning icon on the 3rd, where a feed had not yet come up, and there was on her face the faint, patient expression of a person who has stood in a great many rooms like this one and has learned that they are all, underneath, the same room. "What do you figure?" Nolan went on, warming. "Family day visitor? Somebody's mom? Took the wrong hallway looking for the gift shop? Or, no, new admin hire, can't find personnel, wandered into the grown-up room." He was pleased with himself. Each guess was wrong in a way that the audience, if they had known, would have found unbearable. Because a woman who had carried a dying man 400 meters across open ground was standing in front of them being called a tourist, and the not knowing was the whole engine of it. "Tell you what, ma'am, stand right there, enjoy the show. Just don't touch anything, and don't talk to my soldiers." Boone tried once. He half stood at the signals bench and said, "Sir, the badge desk cleared her. I saw the—" Nolan talked over him without even turning. "Nobody's asking signals." Boone sat back down slowly. The 2 officers chuckled at that too, at the specialist being put in his place, and Boone's ears went red, and he looked at his screen and said nothing more. But his jaw was set now, in a way it had not been. And this was the part the woman in the blue jacket saw most clearly of all, because she had spent 30 years learning to see it. Not the loud man, but the quiet ones around him. A warrant officer at the intelligence bench, who had been in long enough to know better, looked down at his keyboard and found something to type. A captain by the front wall studied the spinning icon on the third screen, as though it might resolve into an excuse. 2 soldiers near the door found reasons to step into the corridor. It was not cowardice, exactly. It was the small, ordinary, human arithmetic of a tired room deciding that this was not the hill, that the lieutenant would tire himself out, that someone senior would surely handle it if it mattered. She had watched rooms make that arithmetic her whole career, and she had learned the one hard thing about it, that the arithmetic is almost always wrong, and that the cost of it is almost always paid by whoever had the least power to object. Tonight that was supposed to be a woman in a blue jacket. She did not resent them for it. She simply catalogued it, the way she catalogued everything, and filed away which of them had looked away, and which, one specialist, 21 years old, with red ears and a set jaw, had not. The woman caught Boone's eye, and she gave him the smallest nod. "See it," the nod said. "Don't fight it." "Not yet." It was the nod of a commander to a soldier, though Boone did not have the word for that yet, and it steadied him more than an argument could have. If you have ever watched the young mistake quiet for weakness, watched a room laugh at exactly the person it should have been standing for, then stay with this one and subscribe to the veteran vault, because the correction is coming, and it is worth the wait. The door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Command Sergeant Major Thorne came back onto the floor. He came back pale under his tan, and he came back moving with a new and deliberate care, the way a man moves when he has just understood that the next 10 minutes are going to be remembered for years, and he intends to be on the right side of them. He did not go to the woman. He went to a spot on the floor from which he could reach both her and Nolan in 2 steps, and he set his feet there, and he waited, and his waiting had weight. Nolan did not notice. Nolan had a woman to remove. He had grown irritated in the way that a young man grows irritated when a joke will not end on his schedule, when the tourist will not leave, and the sergeant major keeps hovering, and the board is somehow more interesting to the room than he is, and so he decided to solve it. "All right," he said. "That's enough. Ma'am, you're leaving. I don't know who signed for you, but I'm pulling the badge and writing this up. You do not wander a classified floor. I don't care whose grandmother you are." Thorne moved. "Lieutenant, a word." "In a second, Sergeant Major." Nolan waved him off without looking, and he read the CSM's caution exactly backward, the way frightened confidence always does. He heard a senior enlisted man telling him to be careful, and he decided it meant the senior enlisted man was on his side, was warning him that this could get official, was backing his authority. He did not hear the actual warning, which was, "Stop." It is one of the oldest and saddest things in any army, the way a young man can be handed his own rescue and mistake it for applause. Nolan took the woman by the elbow. It was not a violent thing, not yet. It was the casual, entitled contact of a man steering a problem toward a door. But the moment his hand closed on her arm, the temperature in the room dropped, and the woman in the blue jacket did the only thing she had done all night that changed her posture at all. She looked at his hand. She looked at his hand on her arm, unhurried, the way you'd look at a leaf that had landed on your sleeve. And then she lifted her eyes to his face, and there was nothing in her expression that a camera would have caught. No anger, no fear, no flare. And yet every person near enough to see it felt the small animal part of their brain go quiet and alert. "You should be very careful," she said evenly, "what you put in writing tonight." Nolan heard a threat. The audience, if it had known, would have heard a fact. Are you threatening me? He almost laughed. He tightened his grip to make the point that he could. I'm going to pull this badge, and I'm going to file a report. And by the time it clears, you'll be lucky to get back on this post for a son. Thorne was there now, between them, and his voice had dropped into the register that 31 years builds, the register that doesn't rise because it doesn't need to. He put himself in the small space between the lieutenant and the woman, and he said 4 words, one at a time, each one its own sentence. Son, stand. Down. Now. Nolan stared at him. It did not compute. An NCO does not talk to an officer that way in front of other officers, and the fact that this one just had. The fact that Command Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, who did not raise his voice, had just planted himself like a wall, was so far outside Nolan's understanding of the room that his mind simply refused it and reached for the nearest familiar thing, which was to be offended. Sergeant Major, I don't know what your problem is, but I am the battle captain on this watch, and I am not going to be corrected by— You have no idea who that is. Thorne said it low, and he said it flat, and it was not a taunt. It was almost a plea. Lieutenant, I am telling you as plainly as I know how. Take your hand off her. Step back. You are about to end your own night, and I am trying to keep you from it. I've been doing this since before you could drive. Believe me on one thing tonight, and it is this. The room had begun to sense the reversal before it could understand it. That is the thing about a watcher. A senior man's certainty is its own kind of siren, and men who cannot yet see the danger will still, on instinct, orient toward the one person who clearly can. The 2 junior officers had stopped smiling. Their coffee had gone forgotten in their hands. At the signals bench, Wyatt Boone had risen quietly to his feet and squared his little station, watching Thorne's face and taking his cue from it, because Boone had already decided which way this was going to go, and he wanted to be standing when it did. Nolan bristled at being corrected by an NCO in front of officers, and his confidence, which had never been earned, did the thing that unearned confidence always does under pressure. It doubled. Thorne glanced at the door. He glanced at the wall clock. 21:55. In 5 minutes, Thorne said, and now his voice was almost gentle, almost sad. You are going to wish, for the rest of your career, that you had listened to me right now. I can't make it any simpler than that. 5 minutes. The woman in the blue jacket said nothing at all. She had gone still again, wholly still, and she watched the young lieutenant the way you watch whether you have already survived. There was no triumph in it. If anything, there was something almost like sorrow, the sorrow of a person who knows precisely how the next few minutes will feel for the boy in front of her, and would spare him if he had given her any way to. What the boy in the pressed uniform did not know was standing behind him in a plain blue jacket, waiting with the patience of someone who had waited out much worse. Subscribe now, so you do not miss what she did next, and what a 2-star general did the moment he walked through that door. The door stayed closed. For 5 minutes, it stayed closed. And in those 5 minutes, the story goes back 8 years, to a ridgeline in Syria, because the plain blue jacket was carrying something, and you cannot understand the next part until you know what. It was 2018. She was 30 years old. The heat there was not like other heat. It came up off the ground in the afternoon, and it did not leave when the sun did, and the dust was in everything, in the teeth, in the rifle, in the folds of the map, in the corners of the eyes, so that every man on that ridge wept a little all day, without meaning anything by it. The blocking position was a low shelf of broken rock on the shoulder of a ridge, and it had been given a job that any honest planner would have called optimistic. Hold the seam for 20 minutes while the main effort repositioned. 20 minutes. That was the promise. Hold for 20 minutes, and then fall back through the wadi and be gone before anything could close on them. They held for 2 hours. The counterattack came at last light, faster and heavier than anyone had drawn on any board, and the line buckled at the seam the way lines do. Not with a bang, but with a slow, sickening give. One position going quiet, and then the next, the volume of your own fire thinning until you can hear how alone you are. She was a captain then. She moved to the seam, not because a manual told her to, but because that is where the give was. And she steadied the element the way she steadied everything, not by shouting, but by being there. A low voice on the net, and a body in the gap, and a calm that spread outward from her, because there was nothing else to hold on to, and she made herself the thing to hold on to. On the net that night, her call sign held the element together, like a hand around a broken cup. Longbow, 400 meters of open ground behind them, and a wall of noise in front, and the voice on the net stayed level. Grid, distance, count. The numbers coming out of her steady and exact. 40 rounds, 800 meters, 90 seconds. Hold, hold, hold. And men who were 19 years old and certain they were about to die did not die, because a woman 30 years old refused, out loud, in complete sentences, to let them. There is a kind of courage that looks like fury, and there is a kind that looks like arithmetic, and hers was the second kind, and it was the rarer. There had been a private that night, a boy of 19 at the far end of the position, who had begun to come apart the way the young sometimes do when the noise gets bigger than their whole short lives. Not screaming, worse than screaming, going silent and small and useless, his weapon forgotten in his hands. She had crawled to him through the last of the light. She had not shouted at him, and she had not comforted him, because neither would have reached him. She had given him a task, a sector, a count, a simple thing to do with his hands and his eyes, small enough to fit inside the narrow space his fear had left him. She had said his name, and then she had said the sector, and then she had said, "Do that and nothing else, and I will worry about the rest." And the boy had done it, because a task is a rope, and a frightened person will hold a rope, and he had held that sector for the rest of the night, and walked off the ridge on his own 2 feet, and gone home and grown old, or old enough, and never known that the reason he had a life at all was that a captain had understood, in the middle of a collapse, that courage can be handed to a person, one small job at a time. That was the thing she knew that no board could teach and no medal could hold. That was what the plain blue jacket was carrying, along with the weight of the one she had not been able to hand anything to in time. Staff Sergeant Andre Cutter was hit at the wire. He was 26. He had a laugh that carried across a motor pool, and a wife's photograph laminated in his helmet band, and a way of calling everyone, officers included, by a nickname he'd assigned them. He had called her Boss from the first week. Never captain, always boss, and made it sound like both a joke and a promotion. And he went down at the wire with his weight all wrong, folding sideways into the rocks. And she saw it happen from 40 meters, and she did not think about it, because there was nothing to think about. She carried him. 400 meters. Across the open ground, in the last of the light, with the line collapsing behind her and the casualty collection point a smear of vehicles in the distance that never seemed to get closer. She carried a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds, and she did not put him down. Her legs failed, and she made them work. Her arms failed, and she locked them. Twice she went to a knee, and twice she rose. And the whole way she talked to him, low and steady, the same voice she used on the net, telling him about the vehicles up ahead, and the medics, and the flight, and his wife, and the nickname, and all the ordinary tomorrows she was going to drag him back to whether he cooperated or not. Later, there would be a citation, and the citation would use words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, and the words would be true, but the words would miss it. The valor was not in the carrying. The valor was that across 400 meters, with every reason and every excuse, she never once put him down. He died at the collection point. He died with her hand pressed to the wound, and his blood on both of them, and the medics working fast and clean and hopeless, and her voice still level, still on the net, still holding the rest of them together, while her own heart broke in a way that does not fully mend. He died, and she stood up, and she wiped her hands on her trousers, and she went back to work, because there were still men on that ridge who were alive and intended to stay that way, and holding them was her job, and she did her job. They gave her the Silver Star for it. She wore it exactly once at a ceremony, and then she put it in a drawer, because to her it did not feel like a medal. It felt like a receipt for something she had not been able to save. In the years after, when younger officers asked her about the ridge, and they always eventually asked, she would tell them the grid and the timeline and the tactical lesson and nothing else, and they would go away thinking she was modest. And she would sit alone with the one thing she never said, which was his weight, which she still felt some nights in her arms. And now, 8 years on, the same stillness stood at the back of a war room, while a boy in a pressed uniform called her a tourist and reached for her arm, and she watched him with the patience of a person who has already stood in a place where patience is the only thing between the living and the dead. The clock read 21:58. Nolan, humiliated now, genuinely humiliated, because the sergeant major had planted himself in front of an officer, and the room had gone silent, and the joke had curdled into something Nolan could feel slipping away from him, made the last bad decision of his night. He decided to fix it himself. He decided that whatever Thorne was so worried about, the cleanest thing was to have the woman gone before it arrived. And so he stepped around the sergeant major, and he took her by the arm again, hard this time, hard enough that it would leave a mark, and he reached for the visitor badge at her chest to strip it off. He was going to march her out. He was going to remove the problem with his own 2 hands and be standing tall and unbothered when whatever the CSM feared came through that door, and the badge came first, because the badge was the proof she didn't belong. The woman permitted the first grab. She did not permit the second. She moved exactly once. It was not a strike, and it was not a struggle, and afterward, not one person in the room could have told you precisely what she did. Only that his reaching hand arrived at her chest and found nothing there to take. That his grip on her arm simply ceased to matter. That the whole confident architecture of his intent met her set feet and her turned shoulder and came apart against her without any visible force at all. The way water comes apart against a stone that has been in the river for a very long time. His own momentum went somewhere it had not planned to go. He recovered his balance a half step later with the specific, disorienting embarrassment of a man who has pushed on a door that turned out to be a wall. For one breath, the plain blue jacket was gone. For one breath, the room saw the operator underneath it. Not a threat. Nothing so crude as a threat. Just an absolute and unhurried certainty. The calm of a person who has held a line while it collapsed, and knows, in her bones, the exact and narrow difference between force and control. Her eyes came up to his, and they were the steadiest eyes he had ever looked into, steadier than his instructors, steadier than his father's, and she spoke to him for the last time as a stranger. "You are about to salute me, Lieutenant," she said. "Try to do it well." The main door opened. A voice from the entryway filled the room, the flat, carrying voice of a senior aide who has done this 1,000 times, and it said one word, and the word landed on the floor like a dropped anvil. "Attention!" The whole room snapped upright. Every soldier, every officer, Every specialist at every bench came to attention on pure reflex. Spines straightening before minds could catch up. Chairs rolling back. The small clatter of a room becoming rigid all at once. And Grady Nolan came to attention too. Came to attention on the same reflex. His hand releasing the woman's arm and dropping to his side, and his heels coming together. Before he understood a single thing about why. Major General Roland Crane walked into the war room. He was 55 years old, and he wore 2 stars, and he came in flanked by the interim commander and by Major Corbin Vale, the operations officer, and the change of command that the Night Watch had never been briefed on. The reason a woman in a blue jacket had been standing quietly at the back of the room reading the board at 2100 hours was about to happen now, in front of all of them. The general's aide carried the folder. The interim commander's face was carefully blank in the way of a man handing over something he loved. It was to have been a small ceremony, a quiet one, the incoming commander walking her own floor on her own terms before the morning made it official. She had asked for it that way. She had wanted to see the room as it truly was on a tired night before anyone dressed it up for her. The general did not stop at the podium that had been set up near the front. He did not stop at the front row where the senior staff had assembled. He walked, and the room watched him walk, and the walk was long. The whole length of that war room, past the map board with its one corrected grid, past the signals bench, where Wyatt Boone stood ramrod straight, with something breaking open in his face, past the 2 junior officers from the coffee urn who had gone the color of paper, past First Lieutenant Grady Nolan, who stood at attention and watched a 2-star general walk directly toward the tourist. He stopped in front of the woman in the blue jacket. For a moment, nothing moved in the whole room, and in that moment, every person on the floor performed, silently and at speed, the same terrible piece of arithmetic that Grady Nolan was performing, following the general's walk backward from where it had ended, past the front row, past the staff, past the podium, all the way to the woman at the wall, and understanding what the length of that walk meant. Command Sergeant Major Thorne let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 31 years. The 2 junior officers from the coffee urn had stopped being young men enjoying a show and become, abruptly, witnesses to something they would be careful, for the rest of their careers, never to describe too loudly. And the woman herself, for one private half-second before the ceremony took her, looked not at the general and not at the guidon, but at the map board across the room, at the corrected grid on the northern phase line, and something almost like peace crossed her face. Because a board that was right was a board that would not get a 19-year-old killed, and to her that had always mattered more than any ceremony ever could. The interim commander stepped forward and, with the care of ceremony, furled the task force colors from their stand and passed the guidon to the general. And Major General Roland Crane took the staff of that guidon in both hands, and he turned, and he placed it into the hands of the woman in the plain blue jacket, and he named her so that every soul on the floor could hear it. "Lieutenant Colonel Raina Kessler," the general said. "Call sign Longbow. It is my honor to give you your task force, Colonel. It could not be in steadier hands, and I have watched those hands do impossible things." She took the guidon, and she shed the plain blue jacket, folding it once over her arm with the same economy she did everything, and underneath it was the uniform. And on the uniform, above the ribbons, sat the pale blue field and the small white stars of the Silver Star. Grady Nolan's face began to move. It moved the way a face moves when a man's entire model of the last 20 minutes collapses at once. The smug residue first, still hanging there because it had not yet gotten the message. Then confusion, the eyebrows drawing together as the pieces refused to fit. Then disbelief, a small shake of the head, a silent, no, because it could not be. Because he had called her a tourist, because he had taken her by the arm, because he had reached for her badge, because he had promised, out loud, in front of witnesses, to write her up. Then recognition, the cold flood of it, the name Kessler, and the word, Colonel, and the 2 stars, and the guidon all arriving in the same instant and fusing into a single unbearable fact. And then, last, horror. Pure, total, career-deep horror, as First Lieutenant Grady Nolan understood that the woman he had spent the night humiliating in front of the floor was the commanding officer of everyone standing on it, himself most of all. The room was silent. Then, as one, it held its salute, and the salute was for her. Lieutenant Colonel Reyna Kessler settled the guidon against her shoulder, and she returned the general's salute, crisp and unhurried. The way she had returned 10,000 salutes across a career, the room was only now beginning to imagine. And then she turned. For the first time all night, she turned fully, squarely, and looked directly at First Lieutenant Grady Nolan, and let him see that she had seen all of it, and let the silence do the rest. The reckoning came fast, because the Army is efficient about such things. Major Corbin Vale, 44, the operations officer, did not wait for an order. He stepped to Nolan, and he relieved him from the watch on the spot, in a low voice that carried anyway in the silence. "You're relieved, Lieutenant. Step off the floor. Report to me at 06. And there was in the room the collective inhale of people who know they are watching a young man's career end, who have seen it end this way before, who expect the rest of it to follow. The report, the counseling, the letter of reprimand that trails a man from assignment to assignment, like a limp he never quite loses. That is what everyone expected. It is not what happened." Lieutenant Colonel Kessler handed the guidon to the sergeant major, who took it with both hands and a small, grave nod, and she looked at the wreckage of Grady Nolan standing there at the center of the worst night of his young life, and she did the thing that the whole story had been quietly promising from the first cold word. "Major Vale." Her voice was level, the same level it had been on the net 8 years ago. "Belay the relief for cause paperwork." Vale turned. "Ma'am?" "You heard me." She stepped forward, unhurried, until she stood in front of Nolan, and she looked up at him, because he was taller, and it did not matter at all that he was taller. "Lieutenant, look at me." He looked at her. It cost him everything he had. "He's a good officer, having the worst night of his life," she said. And though she said it to Vale, the whole room was the audience now. "I've had worse. A man who's never been humbled isn't finished. He's just not done yet. I am not going to end a career over 10 loud minutes and a bad assumption, because if that were the standard, half the general officers I've served would have been privates forever. I'm going to do something harder to him than a reprimand." She held Nolan's eyes. "Assign him to the sergeant major. 90 days. He works under command Sergeant Major Thorne. He learns this floor from the cable runs up, and he learns what that visitor badge could have been, and he never again in his life assumes he knows who is standing quietly at the back of a room. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this old soldier's story find the people who need it, the ones who have been underestimated and answered it with grace instead of teeth." She turned to the signals bench then. "Specialist Boone." Wyatt Boone came to attention so fast he nearly took the station with him. "Ma'am." "You stood up," she said, "when it would have been easier to sit, and you tried to tell the truth twice when nobody in this room wanted to hear it. Remember that it was cheaper tonight than it will ever be again. The price of telling the truth only goes up, and you keep paying it anyway. That's an order, and it's the easiest one I'll ever give you." It was not a medal. It was better than a medal coming from her, and Boone would carry it longer than any ribbon, and years later, wearing more rank than he could imagine tonight, he would say those words to a frightened young soldier of his own. Hours later, when the floor had emptied, and the ceremony had folded itself back into boxes, and the new commander's guidon stood at last in its stand, catching the low light, First Lieutenant Grady Nolan reported to Command Sergeant Major Elias Thorne, as ordered. He came in humbled and hollow-eyed, expecting contempt, braced for it, almost hungry for it, because contempt would at least have been simpler than mercy. And Thorne gave him none, because Thorne had watched 1,000 young men be certain, and had learned that the certain ones either break into something better or break for good, and the difference is usually whoever is standing in front of them at the moment they break. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Thorne said. "You had a bad night. Let me tell you about a worse one. A ridge line and 400 meters, and a staff sergeant named Cutter. So you understand what you were standing next to, and what you almost put your hands on, and what you get to spend the next 90 days learning to deserve." And Nolan sat, and he listened, and the reconciliation began, not gifted, not clean, but earned across the 90 days that followed, one honest hour at a time, until the young man who walked off that floor in horror became, slowly, a better officer than the one who had walked onto it in pride. The 90 days were not gentle, because Thorne did not believe in gentle when better was available. Nolan traced cable runs on his hands and knees and labeled panels that should have been labeled the first week. He sat with the day shift analysts and learned how a checkpoint gets fat-fingered onto a board and how many people can look at the error and not see it, and the lesson of the transposed grid, that the person who catches the thing everyone missed is not always the person with the most rank in the room, went into him and stayed. He stood the worst watches. He wrote no reports on anyone. And somewhere in the second month, on a night as tired as the first one, a contractor with a visitor badge came onto the floor to service a rack, and a specialist made a joke about it under his breath. And it was First Lieutenant Grady Nolan who crossed the room, quietly, and told the young man to knock it off, because you never know who is standing at the back of your room. And I mean that more than you will understand for a while. He did not tell the specialist why. Some lessons a man keeps for himself as the price of having learned them. But Command Sergeant Major Thorne saw it from across the floor and said nothing, and allowed himself, for the first time in 90 days, the smallest nod. Late that night, alone, Lieutenant Colonel Raina Kessler walked to the task force memorial wall at the far end of the building, the wall the unit had brought with it from its last home, the names of its dead cut into dark stone and lit from below by a single soft light. She found the one she had come for, Staff Sergeant Andre Cutter. She stood in front of it the way she had stood in front of the map board, still, complete, present. And the years were audible in that stillness if you knew how to listen. 8 of them, laid down one over the other like coats of paint. A woman came quietly up beside her, Della Cutter, 66, Andre's mother, who had been the general's guest at the ceremony and had waited, patient as her son had never been, for the room to empty. She did not speak at first. The 2 women stood together in front of the name, and the soft light lit both their faces, one lined and one weathered, and for a moment they might have been any 2 women grieving anywhere in the long history of it. "You carried him," Della said at last. It was not a question. "They told me. 400 meters. I've read the words 100 times. I never got to say it to your face." "He'd have carried me," Kessler said. "He'd have complained the whole way. He'd have given the medics nicknames. He called me boss." Her voice did not break, but it slowed, the way a river slows where it deepens. "He'd have carried me and never let me hear the end of it." Della laughed, a small, wet laugh, the laugh of a mother hearing her son's exact self described by a stranger who had loved him too, and she reached out and touched the cut letters of her son's name, tracing them the way you trace something you cannot get back. And Reyna Kessler reached out too, and rested 2 fingers against the stone beside the older woman's hand. "They gave you a whole task force today," Della said softly, not looking away from the name. "I saw the general walk the length of that room. I saw their faces." She turned then, and looked at the woman beside her, and her eyes were clear. "But you didn't come here for the task force. You came here for him." "I come here for all of them," Kessler said. "He's just the one who calls me boss." Present tense. She had said it in the present tense, and neither woman corrected it, because some names do not move to the past, no matter how many years you lay over them. The command was not the point. The guidon was not the point. The 2 stars that had walked the length of the room were not the point. The point was here, in the cold letters on a dark wall, in a mother's hand and a soldier's hand, resting on the same name, in a promise, kept across 400 meters and 8 years, and 1 loud, foolish night that had, in the end, remembered what it owed her. The command had come to her the way everything true had ever come to her, quietly and late, and to someone who had long since stopped needing it to arrive and would have traded all of it, guidon and stars and silver star and the whole long distinguished ledger of her service, for 1 more complaint from a staff sergeant on a 400-meter walk. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.